Hello, everyone.
Back at it again.
Back at it again.
Good day, good day.
That's stealing. You know that, right? That's stealing.
No, you can't steal words.
You're stealing a catchphrase.
Nobody knows whose catchphrase that is.
We know, and that's terrible. All right.
For some people.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Hey, Nikki.
Hey, Nikki.
Let me see. Is this better?
I guess so. Wow, that's huge.
No.
Alrighty.
Hello. We're still trying to figure out our intro. Still not working.
After a whole year, right?
Yeah, still not working.
All right. We will be continuing on our Bible study out of Matthew chapter 26, and we are finishing up 26 today.
Oh, yes.
This is a tough one. It's not tough, but
No.
this is a sad one to me.
Oh, you okay?
Yeah.
All right, we'll get through it. We'll get through it together. We'll make it. Did you want to go and read it?
All right, reading out of Matthew 26, verses 57 to 68. It says, Then the people who had arrested Jesus led him to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the teachers of religious law and the elders had gathered. Meanwhile, Peter followed him at a distance and came to the high priest's courtyard. He went in and sat with the guards and waited to see how it would all end. Inside, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find witnesses who would lie about Jesus so they could put him to death. But even though they found many who agreed to give false witness, they could not use anyone's testimony. Finally, 2 men came forward who declared, This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, Well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself? But Jesus remained silent. Then the high priest said to him, I demand in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus replied, You have said it, and in the future you will see the Son of Man seated in the high place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, Blasphemy! Why do we need other witnesses? You have all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict? Guilty, they shouted. He deserves to die. Then they began to spit in Jesus' face and beat him with their fists. And some slapped him, jeering, Prophesy to us, you Messiah, who hit you at that time? Dang.
So we got the story of Matthew, basically of Jesus' first trial before the high council in Matthew. But it's important that we get the full backstory. So before we get into what Matthew's account of this goes, let's go over to John chapter 18. And John chapter 18, we're going to start at verse 12. And it says, So the soldiers, their commanding officer, and the temple guards, this is when Jesus first got arrested Jesus and tied him up. First, they took him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. So we know that this happened before they went to go see Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the one who had told the other Jewish leaders, It's better that one man should die for the people. So we drop down after that to verse 19. Inside, the high priest began asking Jesus about his followers and what he had been teaching them. Jesus replied, Everyone knows what I teach. I have preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple. So this mirrors what we learned last week when he asked them, Why didn't you arrest me while I was in the temple? So basically he's restating that. Like, don't act like you don't know what's going on. I've been teaching this. I've been saying the same thing from the beginning. I've been here this whole time, and this is what I've been saying. He said, I have not spoken in secret. And that's important, because when we talk about the distinctions between Christianity and other religions, one thing that we can say, sometimes in other religions, things are very, if you ever read like Taoist books or Buddhist books, sometimes they can be kind of riddly, if that's a word. And instead, what Jesus is saying is, I spoke out in the open. Nothing about me was secret. I did my ministry was out in the open. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said. Then one of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. Is that the way to answer the high priest? He demanded. Jesus replied, if I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me? Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. So we know that Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, was also a high priest. So it was actually two high priests at the time. And I think I read somewhere that what it was is that one was deemed the high priest by the actual Romans, and one was recognized within the Jewish church as the high priest. But they just happened to be father and son-in-law, so it worked out better for them, of course, because they had Roman backing on everything that they did. They had the ability to call soldiers for that. So what's interesting is that he slapped Jesus across the face. So in both accounts so far, we know that he's been assaulted. Then Jesus replied, if I said anything wrong, you must prove it. Because Jesus knew what was the law at the time. In order to convict somebody of something within the Jewish religion, and at the time, what you had to do was bring two witnesses who said the same story. Mm-hmm. So you couldn't just say, well, this person is a blasphemer because I heard him say something that was against God. No, you had to have a witness to say yes. And what they would do is, well, interview, and you had to say the same exact story in order for you to be convicted of that. So Jesus knew that. And so that's basically what he's saying. He says to them, well, you can't convict me of anything because you have to prove it. So Annas sent Jesus over to Caiaphas. So then we go back to Matthew 26, and then we get into it. It says, then the people who had arrested Jesus led him to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest. This is after he met with Annas already, where the teachers of religious law and elders had gathered. Meanwhile, Peter followed him. And this is going to get interesting in a second when we're talking about the next part of what we're going to cover today with Peter. So pay attention to this closely. It says, meanwhile, Peter followed him at a distance and came to the high priest's courtyard. So he entered into the courtyard of the high priest. He went in and sat with the guards and waited to see how it would all end. Inside, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find witnesses. So remember, Jesus made it a point when he was talking to Annas to say, unless you've got some witnesses, you can't do nothing to me. You can't touch me. So when they get over to Caiaphas, they're looking for witnesses. And it says, we're trying to find witnesses who would lie about Jesus so they could put him to death. Because ultimately what the Pharisees and the Sadducees have been saying for a long time is how they want to kill Jesus. What I found interesting, I think I read or heard somewhere today that, I don't remember, I think it was Caiaphas, they were saying that he was actually a Sadducee. He wasn't a Pharisee, he was actually a Sadducee, which would have been the more liberal sect of, at the time. I thought that was kind of interesting. But even though they found many who agreed to give false witness, they could not use anyone's testimony. The reason being is because while they were giving the testimony, it wasn't aligning with one another. Mm-hmm. So somebody was giving a false, so they would say, yes, I'll give a false witness against Jesus. I'll speak up against Jesus. So they go, okay, say what happened. And they would say something, and the next person would come in and say, okay, what happened? And their stories would conflict. And so then the high priest said, finally 2 men came forward who declared, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. And that's where they were able to get him. Even though that was a lie, that's not what Jesus said. That was taken out of context. That's not what he said. And Miriam has it right here, exactly what was said.
In John 2, verse 18 to 22, it says, so the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So
in other words, he's saying, you destroy the temple.
No.
Yes, he's saying, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. He's not saying, he said he would destroy the temple. And that's not what he's saying.
I heard a pastor preaching on this, and his take from that was also Jesus basically Satan speaking about himself. They will destroy this temple.
Yeah, he was talking about his body.
His body as the temple, and in 3 days it will be raised up. And now, but they were taking Jesus's words and twisting it.
Yeah. And that's what I meant, because what they said here, what they said Jesus said was, mm-hmm. I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Yeah. When he just said, destroy this temple. So you destroy the temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. So they again, Miriam's point is correct. They twisted they twisted his words for their own benefit, because what they were trying to do is accomplish a goal. What was the goal? Try to get Jesus into a blasphemy. So then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself?" But Jesus remained silent. Then the high priest said to him, "I demand in the name of the living God." Isn't that amazing that you hear? Could you imagine how, like, I mean, I'm sure he had more big pressing matters on his mind, but could you imagine, like, Jesus in his mind when somebody says, to Jesus, who is God in the flesh, "I demand in the name of the living God." Like, he could have been like, "That's me." But, "I demand in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And I love these answers that Jesus gives, because they're so simple, but they say so much. And sometimes, we hear the saying, what is it? Like, saying less is more, like, it means more, less is more. And I think that's what Jesus does, because he doesn't go into this big, long speech. A lot of the times when they ask him, what were you saying to these people in the temple? He said, "Well, ask them. Are you the Son of God? You said it. Who is going to betray me? Is it me? You said it, not me." It's kind of one of those things that, less is more. Sorry. "I demand in the name of the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus replied, "You have said it, and in the future you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven." And that's a reference to Psalm chapter 110, verse 1. Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, "Blasphemy." If you read the Bible in the entirety, you'll see that when people would get upset in the Bible over religious things, they would tear their clothes. I guess because, clothes weren't easy to come by, especially, high priest garments. They were something, rather fancy. So, tearing your clothes, or they would tear their clothes and put on burlap and throw ashes on their face or on their head. And that signified that they were, like, in mourning, or they were upset. And so he tore his clothes, which was a signal in the scripture. If you read it, like, something against God just happened, or something against the scripture just happened. So he tore his clothes and said, "Blasphemy. Why do we need other witnesses? You have all heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" "Guilty," they shouted. "He deserves to die." So remember, he had already been assaulted in Annas' house initially. Then they began to spit in Jesus' face and beat him with their fists. And some slapped him, jeering, "Prophecy to us, you Messiah. Who hit you that time?" So basically they were making light of the situation. Hey, John, they were making light of the situation and what was going on. And they were assaulting Jesus and then saying, "Well, who hit you? Who hit you?" One of those things when you were a kid, you tap somebody on the shoulder and you turn around and you're like, "Who did it?" "Hey, guys, stop it." Kind of making a mockery of Jesus. And so that's pretty much what we see in Matthew's account. It was important to see John's account of the first part so you can tie it together. So, hey, Abby, we're going to see what Mark says. Mark says, I think it's pretty much the same, but he says, "They took Jesus to the high priest's home where the leading priests and elders and teachers of religious law had gathered. Meanwhile, Peter followed him at a distance and went right into the high priest's courtyard. There he sat with the guards warming himself by the fire." So in this one, it tells us that he was warming himself by the fire. Inside, leading priests and the entire high council were, "Hey, Gina, we're trying to find evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death." But they couldn't find any. Many false witnesses spoke against him, but they contradicted each other. That's what we were talking about in the account of Matthew. Finally, some men stood up and gave false testimony. "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without human hands.'" But even they didn't get their story straight. So in Mark's account, it says they went in further and said that he would rebuild the temple, I guess, just by saying it. Then the high priest stood up before the others and asked Jesus, "Well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself?" But Jesus was silent, made no reply. Then the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus said, "I am." And "I am" is a reference to what was said a lot in the Old Testament for God. And especially Exodus chapter 3, verse 14 is a reference for that. "And you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of power at God's right hand and coming in the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothing to show his horror and said, "Why do we need other witnesses? You have all heard this blasphemy. What is your verdict?" And that's the ending of it is pretty much the same. So let's go over to Luke's account. It says, "At daybreak, all the elders of the people assembled, including," I'm sorry, this is Luke chapter 22, at verse 66. "At daybreak, all the elders of the people assembled, including the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. Jesus was led before the high council, and they said, 'Tell us, are you the Messiah?' But he replied, if I tell you, you won't believe me. And if I ask you a question, you won't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated in the place of power at God's right hand." So in Luke's account, he says what? You won't believe me even if I tell you. So he knew that they had a plan, and this is what they were trying to do anyway. So he figured, what's the point in this? Even if I were to ask you a question in rebuttal, you're not going to answer me. And pretty much ending of it is,
They all shouted, "So are you claiming to be the Son of God?" And he replied, "You say that I am."
Yeah, that's kind of what I was saying. He has that, well, you said it, not me. Why do we need other witnesses? They said, we ourselves heard him say it. And then we're going to show in, I think we did John already.
Yes,
yeah, we did John. So John's point was to show us what happened with Annas. Because if you guys don't know this, John's account of the gospel was written last. It was actually written after Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And most scholars believe that it was actually written sometime after. It was written by hey Jessica, the Apostle John, but it was written sometime after Matthew and Mark. And what is believed is he wanted to put it all together because there were certain things that they didn't touch on in some of the other gospels. And that's why you see a story like Annas that was there that wasn't in the other accounts. He just kind of puts it in there because of what was going on. All right. So now we're going to move on.
I just wanted to emphasize a little bit on the whole, how they treated Jesus toward, like, when he was being arrested, where they had him emphasize on, they had this man blindfolded. They were hitting him. They were telling Jesus, well, prophesy now, tell us who hit you. The hate that they had in their hearts to spit at somebody. I don't know, growing up, to me, like, spitting was kind of like the worst of the worst. You could call somebody a bad name, but when you spit in somebody's face, like, that's like really disgusting.
Low, right?
And, yeah. So for them to like just smack him and beat him and throw, and they striked him with their fists, so they're punching him and they're just spitting at him and mocking him. Like, this man really didn't do anything, and they're charging him as a criminal. And usually when they would charge somebody to the point to get crucified, it was somebody believed somebody that was a murderer, somebody that was believed to be a terrorist. What was Jesus doing up until this point but healing people, giving them food, preaching in the he was studying in the synagogues from a child. So, like, for them to treat him this way, the lowest of the lows, to me, it just shows the hatred that they had, how evil their hearts were. And I don't know, I think we need to emphasize a little bit on that, because sometimes we ourselves can still do that in a metaphorical way to Jesus. Not necessarily us as Christians, but the world, it still does that to Jesus, still does that to God, where they mock him and they say, oh, like, even today I posted up a video on Joe Rogan, a philosopher speaking on something that Joe Rogan said about, kind of mocking the whole Christianity and, the miracles and everything. Well, the world still does that to Christ. This world still does that to God, where they mock him and they, make fun of the virgin birth. Oh, yeah, virgin birth. Oh, yeah. Now they know that Jesus was a man that was crucified. They know that he really didn't commit a crime, but yet they'll still make it so that they could mock it, so that they can mock Christianity and our beliefs. And I don't know, that just shows the cruelty, the evilness that people have in this world, and that it still exists today.
Well, I think that a key takeaway from that too is just a few days earlier was the triumphant entry, right, into Jerusalem, where they were treating him as a king coming into the town. And so how quickly it changed from they were receiving Jesus into the town as their next leader to now they're in a position where they want him killed. And what we see from that is they had an expectation from Jesus. And because he didn't fulfill the expectation, which was to liberate them from Rome at the time, they quickly turned their backs on him and said, well, forget it. We don't want him. And so I think sometimes that happens within people within the church. You know, they set expectations from what they want from God and what they want from Jesus. And when things don't happen or they don't happen right away, they say, oh, this is a sham. This is a mockery. I don't want it. You know, it's just something made up. It's easy to say that. It's easy to say, you know, well, you know what? Religion is a made up thing, or God is a made up thing, or Jesus is a made up thing. Because guess what? If it's not a made up thing, there's some things that you have to do. There's some responsibilities that you have to have. And it's just easy to make concessions and say, well, you know what? I would rather be comfortable in my failures thinking, well, there's no God, so I'm okay. Rather than take into account, well, what if there is a God?
Yeah.
You know, and if the God of the Bible is true, then I'm living my life wrong. There has to be something changed. There has to be something done. And people are not comfortable doing that.
One time I was listening to a debate. It was, I believe it was Frank Turek with, darn it. It was an atheist. It wasn't Christopher Hitchens, but it was another atheist, and they were going back and forth. And towards the ending of the debate, the atheist said, look, I was once a Christian. I once believed in your God. But you know what? I went through the hardest time in my life, and that God didn't, and I cried out to him. And I wanted to believe in him, and he didn't show up. And you know what? From that day on, I said, there is no God. It kind of proves and comes back to your point.
Yeah,
where
I've heard similar stories like that from Bill Maher.
Yeah, we hold, a lot of us hold God to a standard, you know, and they say, oh, well, you know, if you're God, let this happen. And you know what? Sometimes with God's mercy and grace, he does it. He listens to those prayers and he allows things to happen. Then there's other times that it's not in his will for it to happen. So when it doesn't come the way you expect it to, that's when they give up. And so now, because he didn't come through for you that one time you once believed, and because he didn't come through for you that one time, you decided to shut the door to grace.
Yeah, and I think what it is a wrong mind frame. A lot of what is taught and is understood nowadays in the church is that God exists for us, when in actuality we are a creation for God. So he created us for his pleasure, for his will, not the other way around. He's not there. He's not a genie for us to just grant wishes. And that's the problem with a lot of this prosperity gospel and these kind of movements where they're teaching, speak it out and God will give it to you. Well, what happens when it doesn't happen? What happens when... Are we still going to exactly. What happens when it doesn't happen at the time I expected it to happen? Mm-hmm. What happens when God wants me to, wait a little longer? Do I throw my hands in the air and say, this didn't work, never mind? Mm-hmm. Or am I going to stick it out and say, I need to understand that God's will is superior than mine? The Bible says, how can we understand the thoughts and the understandings of God? His thoughts are, he formed the whole world. And here we are trying to understand how God thinks. Mm-hmm. He created every mind. He created every mind that exists. How can we try to fathom what God thinks about what we should do or what we shouldn't do? But to your point earlier, you said something about, the hatred. And, Jesus said it himself in John chapter 15, verse 18 and on. It says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. They spit at him because he knew that they would spit at us. If you belong to the world, it will love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Mm-hmm. Remember what I told you. A servant is not greater than his master. So if they treated Jesus like that, he's setting the expectation. He needed to go through that because he knew that people would do the same thing to us. They would spit in our faces. They would spit on our religion. Yeah. They would talk about our God. They would make lesser our God. You could put it in perspective. And I heard somebody say this the other day, and it's so true. Every time an atheist has a debate, why is it always against a Christian? Why isn't it against a Muslim? Why isn't it against a Buddhist? Why when they make these assertions, why is it always the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why isn't it some other guy.
Yeah.
And they're quick to quote things from the book of Egypt or the dead book of Egypt. Well, if you don't believe in any God, why would that be relevant?
Yeah.
You get the picture. You get what I'm saying? When they're making laws, why do they make laws against the Christian religion? Why do they do things against, when they write these books, why do they write books against Jesus? When they write books, why do they try to make all these assertions about Jesus doing extra biblical things or secret things about Jesus? When they make these movies, why is it that they do it about Christians only? You don't hear Da Vinci codes about Muslims or the Buddhists or the Hindus. Why is it always about Jesus? You know why? Because our God is the true God. Mm-hmm. And because of that, that's why these persecutions always happen. And Jesus said it. It's going to happen. And we got to understand that.
I just have Joy Bayer in my head right now from The View. Anyways.
It says, so in 22, he said, if I had not come and spoken to them, they would not be guilty of sin. That's why they're mad. That's what I was saying earlier. It's easier to just discredit it than to understand that you're guilty of sin. But now they have no excuse for their sin. Whoever hates me hates my Father as well. If I had not done among them the works no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin. As it is, they have seen, and yet they have hated both me and my Father. Mm-hmm. So he understood that. This is before all of this was happening. He understood that this was going to happen. This was absolutely necessary. Mm-hmm. So he needed to go through that because this was in preparation for all this stuff.
Yep.
All right, so we're going to continue on with Peter. So remember, I told you guys in the beginning, make sure you pay attention to Peter. Okay, so Matthew chapter 26, or Simon. And
69.
Yep, 26 starting at verse 69 to the end. It says, meanwhile, Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came over and said to him, you were one of those with Jesus the Galilean. And mind you, there's one of the, I'm reading out of the new, the NLT, and there's one part of this that I thought was actually kind of funny in the telling of the story, and we'll get to it in a second. But remember how I said, Jesus was kind of upfront? Mm-hmm. Peter was the same way. He kind of spoke his mind and said, kind of blurted things out. So we'll get there. You were one of those with Jesus the Galilean, but Peter denied it in front of everyone. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. That's one of those classic guy get caught in a situation, grown man getting caught in a situation and don't know what to do. I don't know what you're talking about. 2,000 years later, we're still doing the same thing. Later, out by the gate, another servant.
I just saw a gif in my head.
Yeah, you're like. Later, out by the gate, another servant girl noticed him and said to those standing around, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again, Peter denied it, and this time with an oath, which is really bad. I don't even know the man, he said. Again, a thing that you could see somebody doing now. Wasn't you with that guy in the store? I don't know that man. One of those kind of, it's always clear when, I always tell Miriam, like when we're watching these TV shows and we see when the guy is lying, sometimes we watch shows and the guy's lying. Oh, well, that cut off. Okay, well, now we know. When the guy's lying, they're quick to say, they always make the, I don't know him. And it's always clear that he's lying. You're like, oh, that dude is definitely lying. Mm-hmm. Again, Peter denied it with an oath. Okay, a little later, some of the other bystanders came over to Peter and said, you must be one of them. We can tell by your Galilean accent, which is interesting. Peter swore, a curse on me if I'm lying. I don't know the man. Again, one of those things that you could definitely see somebody saying in 2019. I never met that woman. I never went out with her. Yo, if I'm lying, strike me dead. You heard stuff like that. And immediately the rooster crowed. Suddenly Jesus' words flashed through Peter's mind, which got to be terrible. Before the rooster crows, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. And he went away weeping bitterly. And so that's the culmination of that. But let's look at the other accounts. So we see in here that Peter did deny Jesus 3 times, and the rooster crowed, and thus fulfilling Jesus' prophecy. We talked to our pastor not too long ago, and he said, I love watching your guys' videos because you guys are so simple in the way you deliver the approach and delivering the message. And now I understand what he means.
With your give faces?
Yeah. All right, Mark chapter 14 is the account of this. It says, meanwhile, Peter was in the courtyard below. One of the servant girls who worked for the high priest came by and noticed Peter warming himself at the fire. She looked at him closely, so he's warming himself by the fire. "You were one of those with Jesus of Nazareth." But Peter denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, and he went out into the entryway. Just then a rooster crowed. Then the servant girl saw him standing there, and she began telling the others, "This man is definitely one of them." But Peter denied it. Again, a little later, some of the other bystanders confronted Peter and said, "You must be one of them because of you're a Galilean." Peter swore, "A curse on me if I'm lying. I don't know this man you're talking about." And immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Suddenly, Jesus' words flashed through Peter's mind. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. You even know me." And he broke down and he wept. So in Mark's account, it says what? That he actually, Lonnie, that's right, he's always lying. He actually cried. All right, so we're going to, I think.
Luke is good. Are you reading Luke?
Yeah, is it 23? Yeah.
22.
I don't have. Oh, my bad. Oh, okay, I got it.
Luke 22, verse 54.
It says, "So they arrested him and led him to the high priest's home, and Peter followed at a distance. The guards lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat around it, and Peter joined them there because it was cold. A servant girl noticed him in the firelight and began staring at him. Finally, she said, 'This man is one of the followers of Jesus,' but Peter denied it. 'Woman,' he said, 'I don't even know him.' After a while, someone else looked at him and said, 'You must be one of them.' 'No, man.'" Oh, yeah, this is the account I was saying. "No, man, I'm not." That's one of those things where you're like, I could definitely see somebody saying that. "No, man, I'm not," Peter retorted. I'm sure he didn't say it in that. About an hour later, someone else insisted, This must be one of them because he is a Galilean too."
Man.
But Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. At that moment, the Lord, this is the version that I was like, wow. At that moment, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. So while he's up there, and he says that last denial, I look at it like almost like a movie, like a novela, when they say things and then it just zooms in. I could imagine that's exactly how it felt for Peter. Then when he heard that rooster crow and he looked up and Jesus just locked eyes with him in disappointment and disgust.
Well, it says like he was still speaking when that rooster crowed. So that rooster grabbed the attention.
Yeah.
And so to me, I just see them both like locking eyes, like, oh shit.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like he was like, I envision that Jesus was probably like looking down, listening to the people, and when that crow happened that second time, he looked up at Peter and just locked eyes with him, and Peter was just like, "Oh man,
I told you,
I done messed up, Aaron."
And Peter left the courtyard weeping bitterly. You know what grabbed my attention with this? A few weeks ago, we spoke about Judas, right? And was it last week? And how there's a difference between being sorry and there's a difference between being repentful. Mm-hmm. And we see here with Peter there's a difference between him and Judas. We see the opposites. So Judas felt sorry and started weeping, right? But but what did Judas do? What was Judas's reaction after that? He went and he killed himself. He committed suicide, and one of the worst things happened. Like
we'll talk about that next. That's the next week. Yeah, he killed himself, and it was a bad death.
It was a bad death. Okay,
don't ruin it. Don't ruin it.
Anyways, but then with Peter, we can see he wept and he locked eyes with Jesus. He said he felt bad and he wept bitterly. And we know that by reading the Bible, who Peter came to be. Peter was also crucified, right? And was he the one
upside
that was
down?
Crucified upside down? So I remember we actually did this study or this lesson with the children in church on Sunday. I was teaching the older children. And one child was like, well, she asked the other co-teacher, so if Jesus got crucified, well, Peter did this, did he get crucified? Immediately I was like, no, it was just Jesus. We're talking about Jesus' crucifixion and stuff. But then I remembered, yeah, Peter did get crucified, and he said no, he wanted to get crucified upside down. So we see the difference between Judas's reaction to this, and we see the difference between and we see how Peter reacted to this, where Peter said, you know what, I done messed up right now. I am going, like, he was truly repentful. He wasn't just sorry he got caught. He repented with his life. He changed his life around, and he gave his life to God, and he was one of the founders of the church. So without Peter, where would we be as a church right now?
Well, like I said last week, That story about Peter's denial is actually a redemption story. And we're going to see, when we finish it up, we're going to see what we're talking about when we're talking about as far as redemption, and how only through Jesus can one truly be redeemed, even of the most heinous and worst sins and crimes. No, okay. It's okay. But what we see is that really, it's like I said, it's a story about redemption, and we're gonna, and when we finish it up, we're gonna show you what I mean by that. But it's important for what Miriam said to recognize that yes, we as Christians, we go through things and things happen, and we have to understand that as Christians, yes, we falter, we fall, we make mistakes, but even still, even like she said, Peter went through some of the worst things and did one of the worst things you could have done by denying Jesus. But at the end of the day, who was he to the founding of the church? Who was he to Jesus? Who was he for so many Christians, in his books? So because you fail is not the end. Mm-hmm. Because you've gone through rough times, it's not the end. Because you faltered, it's not the end. You can have your redemption story. All right. Mm-hmm. So, continuing, he said, so look at John's account. John's account of this version of the story is very interesting. And that's why it's key to remember when we're talking about the books of the Bible. Again, John's account was written after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's believed that Mark's account actually was the first account written, and that Matthew and Luke modeled their accounts after Mark's. But we'll finish up with John chapter 18 and his denial. And this is interesting. It says, Simon Peter, John chapter 18, starting at verse 15. It says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. So in this account, it tells us that there were actually 2 disciples that followed Jesus, but John doesn't name him. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Now, it is believed, most scholars believe, that the other disciple was actually John himself. And that's why he was able to write about this, because he says, I was there. I was an eyewitness to this. Peter had to stay, but that's not confirmed or denied. All we know is that one of the other disciples knew some of the people in the courtyard and was able to get in. And so while Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell us how Peter was able to enter into the courtyard, John's account tells us that he actually knew people there and he was able to get Peter in.
So he was allowed to do.
It says Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching at the gate, and she let Peter in. So that first woman that Peter denies Jesus to, she knew who he was because he was with another disciple. So that's why she went over to him and said that. So she knew who he was, even though he denied it. She knew that he was one of the disciples. So that's interesting too. So even she knew, and he lied to begin with, but he lied in the face of knowing that he was being known as a liar. And sometimes that happens. People know they get caught in a lie. I recently had a situation at work where a guy got caught doing something blatant out of, that he wasn't supposed to be doing. And somebody else called him and said, hey man, you're not supposed to be doing that. He said, I wasn't doing anything. And it was like, I just saw you. He's like, no, you didn't. Bro, all you got to say is my bad. All right, so Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching at the gate, and she let Peter in. The woman, now mind you, these 2 disciples come in. The woman asked Peter, you're not one of the man's disciples, are you? Which she knows. He said, I am not. Because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it warming themselves, and Peter stood with them warming himself. Meanwhile, we jump down to verse 25. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, you're not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it, saying, no, I am not. But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, so this person was probably with the procession that went to go arrest Jesus, most likely. And so he recognized him because Peter was the one who chopped off the guy's ear. Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus? So another individual who's just not asking him because they're like, maybe he is. He actually saw him there. And Peter denied it, and immediately a rooster crowed. So John goes into a little more detail as far as the people who were actually, accusing him or asking him about his status with Jesus. So it's interesting to see those things because it gives it into a little more detail. So it just wasn't somebody saying, "Hey, you got an accent. Are you one of those Jesus guys?" And he goes, "No, not me." Mm-hmm. They knew who he was. And pretty much the prophecy had to be fulfilled. And so that's what happened. So you're saying to yourself, man, that's messed up that Peter denied Jesus 3 times. But how many of us in our daily lives deny Jesus by the way we do things every day? How many of us in our daily Christian walk deny Jesus by how we act or what we say or who we're around or, the things we don't do? How many of us have had opportunities to preach the gospel and have denied Jesus by not delivering the gospel to somebody who needs the gospel at the time? So it's easy to judge somebody like Peter and say, well, I would never have done that. But you know what? Sometimes we do stuff that's worse than that in our daily. Some of us do it every day. Yeah. So it's important to keep that in the back of your mind. Sometimes, these stories are given to you as an example so that you can take something away from it.
I was listening to somebody speaking about this, right? And they brought a good point. Matthew 26:40, earlier on, when Jesus is praying, we spoke about this last week, when Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he tells his disciples to come closer to watch him pray. And he finds them asleep. He goes specifically to Peter. He doesn't tell John or James. He goes specifically to Peter, and he said to Peter, "So could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And this pastor's point was Jesus, in a sense, was also prophesying to Peter, saying, you need to be praying right now, because the flesh is weak. The spirit is willing, but your flesh is weak. You don't fall and you might fall into temptation, basically. Mm-hmm. So we see now the same night, within hours, possibly, Peter finds himself tempted to lie. He finds himself in this position where he's like, oh man, like, do I lie? Do I tell them that I am? But what if they hurt me? Remember, prior to this, the disciples, now we know that there was another disciple with him, but where were the other ones? It tells us that they fled. They were scattered. They were scared in a sense, so Peter fell into that temptation. I'm pretty sure he said earlier, no, I would never,
And that's part of that lie. I would never betray you.
I would never betray you. I don't believe Peter thought that he was lying at the moment that he told Jesus he wouldn't betray him. I believe he wholeheartedly believed that he would never betray him in this way. But he got caught up with the temptation. So it also shows us the importance of prayer. It shows us, that we need to stay, and I put in my notes, stay prayed up, because when temptation comes, it's easy to fall into it. Mm-hmm. And you were going to continue on.
That's good. So I remember I told you guys that I've been promising you guys for like 2 weeks, and I'm going to show you that it's a story about redemption. So I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. And so John chapter 21. So this is after the resurrection of the death and resurrection of Jesus. This is after he resurrected. So it says, later, Jesus appeared again to the disciples besides the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there. Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, which are James and John, and 2 other disciples. So Simon Peter said, I'm going fishing. We'll come too, they all said. So they went out in the boat, but they caught nothing all night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, fellows, have you caught any fish? No, they replied. Then he said, throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll get some. So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved, which is John, said to Peter, and it just so happens that John wrote this, said to Peter, it's the Lord. So John says, it's the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, and this is interesting, for he stripped for work, jumped into the water, and headed to shore. The others stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore, for they were only about 100 yards from the shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. So it's interesting because when they saw Jesus and see, this is why Peter's such an interesting character in the Bible. When they saw Jesus on the beach, the other disciples, and when he finally realized that's Jesus on the beach, they were only 100 yards out, so they could have pulled in the net and just rowed it in. He jumped in the water. He put his clothes back on, jumped in the water, and swam because he didn't want to wait. So, there's something to be said for Peter in his personality and his love for God in the face of his adversities and his shortcomings. So there's something to be said for that. So he swims over there and there's food there. So it says, 10 says, bring some of the fish you've caught. Jesus said, so Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to shore. There was 153 large fish, and yet the net hadn't torn. Now come and have some breakfast, Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. This was the third time Jesus had appeared to his disciples since he had been raised from the dead. After breakfast, and this is where it's key. This is the key. Remember, Peter denied Jesus how many times?
3.
Okay. After breakfast, Jesus said to ask Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? What did Peter reply? Yes, Lord. Peter replied, you know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. And third time, he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. So this is predicting the future of Peter and how he would be arrested, how he would be killed and martyred. Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, follow me. So do as I do. So what we see here is a story of redemption because he fell 3 times answering and denying Christ to man. But when he was faced with the resurrected God in front of him, standing before him, he said, Peter, do you love me? 3 times. And all 3 times, instead of denying God, he said, you know I love you. And then that last time, knowing that Jesus knew his heart, he said, you know I love you with everything I have and in my heart. I love you with my heart. And Jesus, knowing the truth, said what? Take care of my sheep. Lead my sheep.
That's exactly what he did.
And that's exactly what he did. And then he follows it with what? In 19. And follow me. So even though it's clear this is such a story of redemption. And what we see is where Peter fell to where he was now, where he's getting to go into in the book of Acts, where he's being tortured for Christ to the point where he's wanting to be flogged. So we go from a person who was denying Jesus in public because he didn't want to be associated with Jesus, to a man who's going to stand before thousands and hundreds of people and say, there is only one way to heaven, and he is Christ. And I know this because I met him. And I know this because I love him, and he loved me back. And he died on the cross of Calvary for my sins. And that's what we have to remember. That's the gospel. That's the message. That's what we take out to the world. That Jesus died for each and one of our sins. And because of that, we are redeemed. And we will never truly see death. Even if we die, we will never truly see death. So it's important to keep that into remember. And I think this is such a bold, powerful story when we're talking about Peter and his redemption, his fall and his redemption. And again, what we see in Peter is a person who most people would say his personality is just so, oh man, he could never be a leader, right? He could never be a leader. He could never be a leader. He's too impulsive. He's not leadership material. But in fact, he was just the man that Jesus wanted. And there was a reason why he would be the one looking at all these things, and him and John John didn't have the same kind of temperament. Yes, he did. Not impulsive, but we know he was passionate because Jesus called them what? The Bonnages, the Thunder Brothers.
It just shows that God uses each individual regardless of,
absolutely.
you know.
And here they are, two different kind of personalities, but it was necessary for them to be together and work together for the benefit of the entirety of the church.
So bringing this all back around, we discussed on the hatred, right? The hatred that people had towards Jesus, and how sometimes we can be just like the Pharisees, or this world can be like that, where they treat Jesus, they spit in his face, they deny, they mock, and everything, right? We see that in this world. We see that, and we see that we ourselves, with our actions at times, have possibly denied Jesus. We have not been the best representatives at times of Jesus. Mm-hmm. But we tie it back around and we bring it to this, where it's the redemption. We see that no matter what, if we come to Jesus, if we finally, if we can just acknowledge and say, Lord, I love you, I want to do right by you,